All right, thank you everybody that has joined us today for our continuing Association Essentials series. Today we're talking about planning for future reserves. Thanks for everybody who's joined us through the HOALiving networks, those that are serviced by CAM down in St. George, FCS Community Management up in Salt Lake, Idaho, HOALiving, and the A+ Accounting Associations. A couple of housekeeping items real quick. Come on, let's see here. If you've missed any of our past Association Essentials series, please visit our website, hoaliving.com. Click on the training tab and then click on Association Essentials series, and you can see all those past sessions there. They're good for review, or even if you watched them and you want to review what we talked about, take a look there and you can see some of the slides there as well. We'd like to thank our continuing sponsor, Max Maintenance. They're currently running a special summer deal for 10% off any all new work orders. Mention this ad and you will receive that, that promotion. They are a great resource and can help out on doing sprinkler repairs, pet waste stations, clubhouses, anything you got going on in your neighborhood. All right, so like I mentioned before, association, we're talking about reserves. We have Dale Gifford here from Complex Solutions. Dale has been a trusted business partner of the HOALiving network. He's been in the industry for a long time. Sat in the seat of a community manager for a long time, helped boards, and then transitioned over to helping associations plans for the future by preparing reserve studies. With that, we will turn the time over to Dale. And if you have questions during the presentation, please throw them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them as we go along. Once Dale is done with his presentation, then we'll jump on with a few key points afterwards. Dale, the time is now yours, my friend.
Thanks, Scott. Hey, everyone. Welcome to reserves. So planning for your future. Reserves is a very important part of your budgeting process and planning for your future. And so I'm glad we can take some time here and help educate you a little bit on how to better do this. So what is a reserve study? So a reserve study is a budgeting tool. Essentially, we're going to tell you how much money do you need to save, have in the bank, and be saving each month in order to be able to replace your different reserve components. As we know, the budget has the operating portion and the reserve portion. Your management company takes care of all that operating portion for you and then helps hook you up with professionals like myself to figure out the reserve portion. We have reserve components versus an operating component. And so how do we know the difference? So one of the things we look at for reserve components is it has to be a responsibility of the association. It has to have a limited useful life. It has to have a predictable remaining useful life, and it has to be above a minimum threshold cost. So it has to be yours. We have to be able to say, hey, this roof has a 25-year life on average. It's 10 years old, and we don't see any obvious signs of premature wear, so it has 15 years of life left. And then the threshold cost just depends per association. Typically 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, somewhere in these ranges, just depending on how many components you have and what you are dealing with in operating. The operating stuff is more of your day-to-day things, your professional fees, your insurances, your landscaping maintenance, and things like that. So who should perform your reserve study? So this is a big question I get all the time. The Utah law does say that the board can choose a qualified person, or they can do it themselves. Other state laws differ if they do have laws on reserves. Not all states do. Professional reserve provider is who I'm going to always tell you who you need to use. We have the experience and the qualifications. We are considered experts in the industry. So if you do get sued, you have somebody in that lawsuit who is the expert. Part of the whole management process for the board members is risk management and transference. So Just like you use a management company to help you make sure that you're following the laws and you're not forgetting things, and you use an attorney to help you interpret your documents and interpret the laws to make sure you're not getting in trouble there. You also want to transfer risk of figuring out your reserves to a reserve professional. Attorneys and insurance providers are going to tell you, use a professional. They always recommend a professional. Having been in the industry for a long time, I know there is always shenanigans going on. There's always a certain percentage of people in your communities that you have some issues with, or they have some issues with something, the rules or whatever. So we are that unbiased third party who comes in, and we're just going to tell you the numbers. We're just going to tell you the facts. And we're not on this side, we're not on that side. We're just going to give you the information. And then we also carry the proper insurance coverage for the different things like that. So what is the cost of reserve study? That's another big question I always get. So every reserve bid that we do, everyone's different. We have to figure out essentially how much time your study is going to take. And to do that, we look at the type community. So if you're a 50-story high-rise versus a 30-unit single-family home neighborhood with just a cul-de-sac, there's going to be a lot of difference in price. So the type of community, the size of community, if you're 1,000 townhomes versus like 10 townhomes, and then the number of reserve components and complexity. So for instance, like in a high rise, you might have 100 different mechanical components that need to be on there. But in that single family home neighborhood, you have like maybe one component, maybe it's the asphalt maintenance. So it's a lot less complex. So generally, the smaller your community is and the fewer components you have, the less expensive it's going to be. The more you have and the more complex, the more expensive. And the price range really is huge. It's like $750 to like $20,000 plus dollars. But really the average study comes in somewhere in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, which is a very inexpensive price to get an expert to give you the information you need. How often do you need a reserve study? So this varies by state law. In Utah, you need an update every 3 years. So the law says every 6 years have a reserve analysis performed and an update no less than every 3 years. So that's been translated as roughly every 3 years, you need to have a study. No matter what state you're in, you should be reviewing your reserve study yearly to see what's upcoming, to see where you stand. And you should be doing a yearly presentation to owners. So in that yearly presentation, I always recommend that people keep it simple. There is a page in the reserve study that's perfect for this, and the funding summary pages. So what do you have in the reserve account? What does the expert recommend you have? What are you saving monthly? What does the expert recommend you save monthly? And then what are your plans for the future? What are the goals that the board has set? How are you going to achieve them? And then what are the upcoming planned reserve projects for the next year? Just keep it simple, keep it short, and then people can ask questions if they want more clarification or more information. What is included in a reserve study? So these 30-page to 200-page reports, there's a lot of information in there, a lot of information. But essentially, the two most important pieces of information are how much money you should already have in your reserve fund, how much money you should be saving each month. So we determine how much money you should already have in your reserve fund by looking at each component and looking at its current cost, seeing how old it is. And then we add all that together. We also factor in if you're behind, factor in inflation, factor in interest on investments, and then how much money that you should be saving each month. So this also goes in with all that information. So how much you should be saving each month to get where you want to be. We always recommend full funding, but every board needs to decide where they want to be. And the key is have the money in the fund when you need to spend the money. So you can't ever go to zero and you can't ever go negative, because that means you don't have the money in the fund you need. We do a governing document review as part of the reserve study. We are not the legal experts. Almost every single governing document or review that I do, I tell the client, whoever the liaison is that I'm working with, you need to get a legal opinion on X, Y, and Z. Because there's always stuff that's ambiguous, there's always stuff that's contradictory, there's always stuff that's confusing. And the best way to clarify all those things is just pay your attorney to get that legal opinion, and then you can make a resolution and put it to bed. There is a site visit component to the initial study and to our updates that have a site visit. During this site visit, we come to the community. We are looking at the different components, and not just reserve ones, we're looking at everything. We are looking for, what is the condition? So, is the paint peeling? Do you have water damage on your siding? Are your shingles curling? Do you even have shingles? Were they all blown off in the wind? We're looking at all these things. Is there a fire shooting out of your pool boiler every time it cycles on and melting all the piping and electrical around it? I encountered that at one of the communities. So we look at these things, and these all factor into, the life and the remaining life of the component. And then we do a financial analysis. We look at how much you're currently budgeting. We look at how much you currently have in your reserve fund. We look at current bids and estimates you have for projects that are coming up. We look at actual invoices for projects that you've completed. And we use all that information to help determine how much money you should have and how much you should be saving. So let's get into the ideal balance a little bit more. This is a question I get a lot. So we're going to recommend that how much money should you have back here? How much money should you already have? Okay, this is going to be the ideal balance. And so this is how we figure it, because I get a lot of people that think we just make this number up and that reserve providers just pick a number of how much you should have. But this is how we actually do it. Okay, so every component has a useful life. So we're going to take an asphalt shingle roof, for example, here. An asphalt shingle roof has an average life of roughly 25 years. And if that roof costs $100,000 to replace, then over that 25 years of life, you should be saving $4,000 per year. So if you save $4,000 per year for 25 years, you will have $100,000. So you will have the money in the bank you need to replace this component. So if that roof is 10 years old, you should have $4,000 per year times 10 years, or $40,000 already in the bank for this component. This is the ideal balance for this single component. We take this and we do this for every single component in the report, add this amount together, and this is the ideal balance. This is the amount of money you should already have in your account as that yearly portion for every single component for as many years of life have already passed. So this is another big one I get. Where do I get my pricing? So there are cost estimating guidebooks out there, and they are used in engineering and building, and they do have a lot of great information. Do I use them? Absolutely not. I do not. They are typically 1 or more years behind, and they also have to be adjusted per region. Well, our region has multiple regions. The cost of roofing down here in the valley where I'm at in Midvale, and the cost of roofing up on Talisker Mountain up in Park City is completely different because they have completely different needs. So we have multiple different areas just in Utah alone that the costs are different. So what we do is I look at actual financial information from the client. So I'm looking at your actual bids, your actual estimates, what you have actually spent in the past, so historical information. And I'm looking at this not just for your community, but other communities. If the community 3 blocks over from you just pay $15 a square foot for something, chances are $15 a square foot is a good price for that something if you have the same thing. So that's what we're looking at. So we're looking at that actual information. And then sometimes we will come upon interesting things. You got a packaged HVAC unit on the top of a medical building or something, and it's completely unique and something we've never come across. Well, then we just got to call. You know, we call up one of these local companies and say, hey, I have this unit. Here's the serial number. Here's the model number. What is a long-term budget estimate to replace this kind of component? And so this is where we get our pricing, actual information for our actual area from what's actually being done and what's actually being planned.
Hey, Dale, there's a good question in the chat about inflation, particularly in today's market where everything is skyrocketing. How do you account for inflation in your pricing?
So we use the building cost index for inflation, and we look at the 30-year average on the building cost index because this is a 30-year financial report. And we don't look at today's inflation rate for like gasoline and milk or the other ones that you typically hear on the news, but we look at the average of the building cost index, which is roughly around 3%. And yes, things are crazy here and there. We've heard about steel being crazy, and we've heard about wood. You know, wood has gone up in price. Countertops have just like skyrocketed. Cabinets have skyrocketed. There's a lot of things that have really gone up, but it does take a while for that stuff to trickle down. And so when we're looking at those things, we don't really look at the panic. We don't really look at right now it's skyrocketing up to whatever percent, because when you look at the 30-year average or even the 20-year average, it starts to like even out over time to roughly 3%. And so you can't really account for the immediate, and so we don't. So as our new bids and stuff come in, as the new invoices come in, you know, we're seeing those new bids for new jobs, then we're looking at them. Okay, why is this bid like 25% more than I would have expected it to be? You know, are they doing something funky? Do they have to, you know, do some special extra work? Or did the actual cost of the material go up? And then we start to take that into account. So as it comes in, we start to take it into account. And so this is another reason that it's important to get those updates, to review yearly, and then to get those updates every 3 years. I mean, there's a lot of the industry recommends an update yearly. We're just following the Utah code here in Utah. And in other areas, they do other stuff different. But that's how we deal with the inflation. It's tricky and it can be kind of scary at times, but it'll either even out or it will stay high. And then as it stays high, we're going to pick it up on that next cycle. Okay. You have your reserve study. Now, what do you do? So you get this big report. Now, what do you do? Now, remember, the two most important pieces of information we talked about that are going to be in the study are back here. How much money should you have and how much you should be saving each month, okay? So as a board, you have to determine what is your funding goal. We always recommend full funding, which is 100% funding. You're going to determine as a board how much risk and liability you personally want to take and how much risk and liability your association is going to take that you're choosing them to take, because you are the leaders, you are the choice makers. The big thing is you have to stay above zero money for the period of the report. I don't think there's any court in the world or anybody else that's going to think that running out of money is good business sense. It's prudent, because the Utah code especially says you have to use prudence and the reserve analysis. So good business judgment and the reserve analysis. So you got to have enough money in there to not run out, to have the money you need for all those projects, and at least a buffer. Again, I'm going to keep on saying this. We recommend full funding. We recommend 100%. But you're going to have to determine. Some associations, you might be able to stay above 20%, and that works really well for you. Some associations might need to stay at 50%, and that works really well for them. Other associations will choose 100%. Now, unfortunately, a lot of associations that are older are in this situation where they have inherited years and years and years of people not doing exactly what they probably should have in the funding department. And so you have $1 million roofing project coming up and you have $100,000 in the bank. Obviously, that doesn't work. There's no roofer that's going to take $100,000 for $1 million project. So you get stuck with the years of other people making plans that aren't working for you now. Those people obviously didn't look at the 30 years ahead and stay above zero, okay? So you have to determine your funding goals, and from that, you determine a course of action. Do we need to increase the dues? Do we need to do a special assessment? Do we need to do a loan? Do we need to increase the dues and do a special assessment? Some of you are very far behind, and you will need to do multiple things. Loans are always an option, and your managers can really help you decide which one of these is the best option. I have seen associations where their documents really hamstring them and don't allow them to fund properly, because they always have to have a vote for what they need, and the owners keep voting it down. The key here is, as a board, you have that fiduciary responsibility, that legal responsibility to properly maintain the community. Not do what the owners want, but properly maintain the community. So as long as you keep making plans to properly do that, if the owners vote you down, you know, I'm not the legal expert, but I think you're going to be covered, because you're trying to do what's right, and they're exercising an option that changes that. But at the very least, most documents allow the board to increase the dues of something each year, and or do some special assessments each year without votes. And if you're far behind, you should at least be doing the maximum you can do without the votes to catch yourself up. And then keep pushing to get where you need to be to have that money in the bank when you need it, okay? So once you determine your course of action, you need to create and adopt a policy. So Association X has decided that we want to stay above 50% funding for the 30-year period. And in order to do that, we're going to raise our $50 per month per door reserve portion to $100 per month per door reserve portion. And this is how we're going to do that. And then you communicate that to the association. If you got to have a special meeting and you got to get the votes, or however your documents say you got to do that, then you got to go about that. So determine what your goal is, determine your course of action, create and adopt a policy as a board, and then communicate that policy to the association, and then take the necessary steps to make it happen. So this is another interesting question I got. So why should we use our reserve study or listen to the professional reserve provider? So one, the biggest reason to get the professional advice is so that you actually have the correct information. I've seen a lot of studies where people have done their own, and some of them do an okay job, some of them don't. It just really depends on the bias of the person, what their goal was. Some of them are actually trying to do what's correct for the community. Other ones are trying to do what's good for their own pocketbook or for their own funding. Regardless, the expert is going to be unbiased. They're using unbiased information. In Utah, it's required by state code that you have a reserve study and that you use that reserve study and prudence to figure out your budget for reserves. But it doesn't say you have to use a professional reserve provider. Again, risk management and risk transference, okay? Fiduciary responsibility. So the board has a fiduciary responsibility. You're trying to avoid liability and avoid bias, okay? So having that information from the professional is going to help you do that. It is very, very easy for somebody to not even really think about it and they introduce their own bias. It happens all the time. It's just, that's a natural part of being human. And again, the key is have that money available when a project needs completed. You want to avoid the deferred maintenance. You want to avoid sudden large dues increases, and you want to avoid special assessments. Small increases over time allow people to adjust their finances more easily. Now, will everybody be able to afford it? No. That's not something I've ever seen a governing document say you should take into account. Obviously it comes into account, right? But that's part of that bias. So you should use a professional because they're going to give you the best information. And then what you decide to do with that information and how you decide to pursue it, you know, that's what we just talked about. But you want to get that professional information so at least you're starting on the right foot. If you're starting, say, with 50% of the components that you should have, or 25% of the components you should have, and then only funding those, like say 50 or 25%, you start way, way behind, and it gives a false sense of where you should be, and it creates a lot of problems. Okay, so that's all I had, Scott. So a big part of my presentations is just answering questions, because there's so many questions that different people have about stuff. And so this is some of my information here. I've been around for a long time. I have a lot of designations. And I believe that FCS is also going to be sharing this different stuff. This is where I'm getting a lot of my information: the Condominium Ownership Act in Utah, the Community Association Act in Utah, the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts Standards of Practice, and CAI's Best Practices Reserve Studies information, and then my contact information. So you can always email me or call me. If you want to request a bid, the best way to do that is on our website. And so I'll turn it over to you, Scott. We can open it up for questions and see what other information people need.
Okay, let's switch gears just a little bit. Dale, thanks for all that great information. We're going to look at some questions, so keep those questions coming in, and we'll try to get to those here in just a minute. So some tips, right? So Dale talked about the importance of getting a reserve study. So what do you do with it now? Let's see if we can get it right. So review, as board members, you need to review your reserve study. Oftentimes we get a reserve study and it goes into a filing cabinet at the back of the drawer, and we're like, hey, we met our obligation of getting the reserve study, but that doesn't really mean anything. So why are we reviewing the reserve study? The reserve study really is a roadmap to help you course correct. If you think, oh, hey, we need $100,000 today to replace our roof, when we get an update, that number may be $150,000, as Dale explained, due to inflation. And so you need to really, really review your reserve study often, at least twice a year, once each your annual meeting, so owners know where the association is at as far as reserve funds, and if they're putting enough money away, but also looking at when you go to prepare your budget. So you can make sure that, hey, what's the recommended reserve contribution that the reserve company is proposing. Do we have that in our budget? Do we need to raise assessments? What upcoming projects do we have? Do we have money in our operating to help kind of cover that and make those decisions? So reviewing your reserve study often helps you use that roadmap and course correct and make informed decisions about how you need to move forward with your association. And that leads into the next one. Develop your financial plan. Last month, we talked about Financials 101, some tips and tricks for budgeting, but the reserve study was a major component because that is, Dale's not going to like it, but that's one of your discretionary items on your budget. The board has, Dale disagrees with me, right? But the board has the ability to decide how much money goes in. Are they going to follow the recommendations? Or are they going to go more of a thresholding funding model and put in a little bit less so they can try to have their money? But the most important part is to make sure that money is going into reserves on a consistent basis so that you have money there. As management professionals, we will tell you to always follow the recommended reserve study contribution, the recommended contribution. That will make sure that you have the money available to replace projects, to replace components when they come up, and also to replace components when they don't meet their usable life. So like your pool heater, those always seem to go out like every couple of years. And so you have money available to make those repairs. And communicate that to your owners. Make sure that they understand where they're at. Nobody likes raising assessments. Nobody likes pulling money out of anybody's pocket. But people need to understand that they have a responsibility for replacing the components in the association. As much as we think about the association as all the things we get from it, we've also, as owners, have bought into all the liabilities and all the components and everything that needs to be replaced. And so we have to keep that in mind and plan, just like you would your house, by putting a little bit of money away each month for monthly repairs. Then we can avoid a lot of that. But then follow your financials consistently. Check and make sure that you are on track for your goals. If you've set a threshold for the amount of reserves that you're going to have, track that. Work with your manager and make sure that you're trying to meet that goal. If you're going for 100% funding, set a realistic goal on how you're going to get there. And the reserve study companies will provide a funding goal to try to help you, tell you how much each year that you should put in and what they're expecting those expenses to be. And so if you follow that plan pretty closely, that will help you get to where you want to go over the course of the 30 years. Again, we talked a little bit about this at the Financials 101 last month. If you missed that or want to review any of the information that went over there, visit our website and click on the Training and Essential Series, and you will find it right there. So we got a lot of great questions, and so let's go through them. Dell and I are probably going to tag team this one. So we got a great question from Amy. How do you know if you are on budget or behind? I'm assuming as far as like your reserve study. So when you get your reserve study, your funding plan, that's a real great way. Look at your balance sheet. Make sure you're looking at that every single month. Sometimes things are more expensive, unfortunately, and that's where Dell kind of talked about the inflation and trying to figure out if asphalt has skyrocketed for some reason or shingles have skyrocketed for some reason. But reviewing your financials and consistently reviewing your reserve study will help make sure that you are on target with those numbers and the expected expenses. Dale, do you have anything you want to add there?
Do you want me to share a sample report? And maybe
yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be super helpful.
Let me see if I can pull this up. Okay, so here's a sample report for a sample association. Let's see if I can adjust the. So if we just scroll here, let's go to the funding summary I talked about. So this is the page I talked about sharing and getting information from. So right up here, can you see me moving my cursor around? I don't know if you can.
Yep. Yep, we can do that.
So this projected starting reserve balance of 100,000, this is what this community actually has in their reserve fund. And so this ideal starting reserve balance right below it, this is what we as the expert recommend they do have in there. And so you can see right here at the start that they're behind, okay? And if we look to the graph here, you'll see on this page, what they're currently doing is the pink line, okay? So when I talked about you want to stay above zero and not run out of money in this 30-year period here, you can see that in this example, what they were currently doing of saving $3,000 per month up here takes them down to zero in 2041. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, that's so far away, we can course correct and stuff. But the problem is small increases over time and small corrections over time are much easier to do and for people to handle than getting here and suddenly this course correction is, oh, we need a special assessment of $400,000 to replace all the roofs, okay? So the recommendation for us on this report was $4,765 per month. And then we put a reference here also the 70% funded of $4,365. So you can see there's a lot of difference between these, but at the very least, we always recommend you do the blue line, okay? We always recommend that, but at the very least, this pink line, you got to keep it like say above 20%. You need to be above zero, but also with a buffer because we know projects have cost overruns. You tear off the roof and the decking's bad, or you tear off the roof and they never did the flashing and the ice and water shield correctly or something like that. So there's always things that pop up into projects that we can't see until those projects are torn open. And so you want this pink line to stay above. And so I think one of the most important parts to answer the question is your pink line above zero? If it's not, course correct. You need to do something to course correct.
And I think, right, like getting the reserve study a lot, I've had a couple of associations that refuse to get reserve studies because they don't want to know. They really don't want to know where they're at. And by the time we finally talked them into getting a reserve study, they were down in that 0 to 3% funded range. And then it's like, oh my gosh, we have a whole parking lot to redo. We need $350,000. We don't know what to do. And so now you're talking about either a bank loan or an excessive special assessment and a whole bunch of upset owners that are like, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do? And so getting the reserve study, getting the information in front of people goes a long way to get people moving in the right direction and understanding your starting point. If you are at 2 or 3% funded, is that great? No, but at least you know where you can go. If you don't have the information, then you can't make any decisions. And so
2 or 3% and you're going up on the pink line, a lot better situation than 2 or 3% and you're going straight to zero next year and never come up.
Correct. Correct, absolutely. So again, get the information, review it a lot, review it consistently, and that will help you make sure that you stay where you need to be. Tim asked, do we have a one sheet, a single reference with laws that we need to comply with? Unfortunately, there's a lot of laws that you need to comply with. In connection with the reserve study in particular, I wish I had this section memorized. I thought I did at one point in time, but it's in the presentation and we can send you the references for those statutes. In Utah, the statute is to get a reserve study every 6 years and update as necessary. Typical industry practice is to update halfway through, so about every 3 years, either with a site visit or with a financial update, depending on if you've done a ton of projects or if you've added more capital expenditures. But again, you need to get the information, and we can get you that reference, Tim, a little bit later.
I think the
All right.
attorneys put together an entire book of all the laws that pertain. So it's a lot of stuff, unfortunately. And that's why professional management is so important, because part of what they do is keep up to date on that stuff to help advise you.
So yes, so get with your community manager, and they can help you. With that. All right. Jeff Baldwin asked, if we feel the reserve study was prepared with a bias, can the board request a new one with another financial specialist? Dell, I'll let you lead off with that one.
You can pay for as many reserve studies from as many companies as you want, to be honest. I mean, it's just a matter of spending the money. What I would look in is, do you really feel it was biased, and why? Or do you not like the information? Because if you are, say, $2 million behind and you only have $100,000 in your reserve account, and you have a $1.5 million roofing project coming up in 3 years, and you think that's biased, I mean, it's really easy to check that. Go get a bid. You probably already have a bid, and that's probably where they got the information of how much that roofing project is going to cost. So I would really look into, why do you think it's biased? What do you think is biased about it before you go and spend more money? Oh, if it was prepared by the builder before the HOA. So I always recommend that anytime an association turns over, they get a new reserve study from a professional reserve provider. So I do actually work with like a dozen or more different developers, and I do preliminary studies from them, from plans, typically before things are even built, a lot of times before ground is even broken. And so even in those situations, I recommend that those builders, before they turn over and after things are built or started to be built, they get an update, because what's planned and what actually happens is not always the same thing. And so, plus you should be getting an update every 3 years anyway. And so if it's taking 3 years to get that project built, they really are due. So I would say, upon turnover, if they have not gotten one from a professional reserve provider like myself, like say in the last year or something, I'd just get a new one. But if the developer or the builder or the old management company or somebody did it themselves and they didn't hire a professional, I would always recommend get one from a professional. Even if it turns out to be exactly the same, I've seen way too many studies and seen way too many people in poor financial positions. It's just worth that few $1,000s or however much it takes. It's just worth it to get the actual information and to make sure that it's correct.
I'll add to that. Recent practice with some of the developers that we have worked with is, as they're approaching turnover, they'll schedule a reserve study. They haven't had one previously, mostly because of the development issues, and plans change throughout the development. So in the few months leading into, usually 2 or 3 months leading into the turnover meeting, they'll hire a reserve company to do the study in order to get the information and make sure that it's accurate. But if there is any question, by all means, reach out to whoever prepared your study, have a conversation with them, or if you feel that there may have been something not quite right, reach out to somebody else and get a second opinion. It doesn't hurt ever to have a conversation and say, hey, these are my concerns. Are you willing to look at that? Because what we found, and particularly with new associations, are homeowners are getting wise to the fact about reserve studies and reserve account balances. So if your association is properly funded and properly keeping your reserve studies going every 3 years at the increment that they should be, that your property values in your association go up and your association is much more attractive. And so keeping all that in mind and making sure that you stay on top of it. And so if there is any question, reach out to your provider, reach out to someone else, have a conversation with them, and make some decisions from there. Let's see here. Okay. Okay. I think that is all the questions. We might have missed one. Let's see here. So just again to touch on Jeff's follow-up question, how often should a board get a reserve study? The state statute, again, just so everybody knows, is every 6 years. So if it hasn't been, if it's been a while, get one scheduled and then updated as needed. As needed is generally if you're adding like an extra pool or extra components that need to be reserved for. It needs to be updated, but typically about 3 years you do a financial study. Dale, when we do those, we send an email to Dale, say, hey, we need an update, and he sends an email back and says, okay, these are all the things that were scheduled. How many of these things did you do, and what did they all cost? And then we can make some changes there. So managers that are on the call, if you need an update, be prepared with that information because it's going to be asked regardless who that company is. But that helps, again, gives you a roadmap of what's been done, what are we planning for in the future to make sure that we are have enough money there. If there are no more questions, it looks like we've answered all the questions. Our next AES Essential Series is talking about board member roles, what each of you are responsible for doing as board members, what the president, secretary does in the meeting, and how to effectively run your association. We look forward to meeting you and talking with you then. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to Dell. He'll be happy to answer any of your questions or reach out to myself. I realized just barely, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Scott Anderson. I work in St. Georgia, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions when it comes to reserve study or general management questions about what you have going on in your association and how we can help. We look forward to you next month, and thank you very much for participating.
Thanks, everyone.